Hello viewers, today we are going to study about the one-act play At the Hawk Well, written by W.B. Yeats. William Butler Yeats was born on 13 June 1865 and died on 28 January 1939. He was an Irish poet and one of the foremost figures of the 20th century literature. A pillar of both the Irish and British literary establishments. In his later years, he served as an Irish senator for 2 terms. Yeats was a driving force behind the Irish literary revival along with Lady Gregory, Edward Martyn and others. They founded the Abbey Theatre, which he served as its chief during his early years. In the year 1923, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature as the first Irishman so honored for what the Nobel Committee describes him as an inspired poetry, which is a highly artistic form, gives expression to the spirit of the whole nation. Yeats is generally considered one of the few writers who completed the greatest works after being awarded the Nobel Prize. Such works include The Tower, The Winding Stairs, and other poems. Yeats was a very good friend of the American expatriate poet and the Bolingnian Prize laureate Ezra Pound. Yeats wrote the introduction for Rabindranath Tagore's Gitanjali, which was published by the Indian Society. He was born in Dublin and educated there and in London. He spent his childhood holidays in County Sligo. He studied poetry in his youth and from an early age was fascinated by both Irish legends and the occult. Those topics featured in the first phase of his work, which lasted roughly until the turn of the 20th century. His early volumes of verse was published in the year 1889, and its slow-paced and lyrical poems displayed Yeats' depths to Edmund Spenser, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and other poets of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. From 1900, Yeats' poems grew more physically and realistic. He largely renounced the transcendental beliefs of his youth, though he remained preoccupied with physical and spiritual masks, as well as with the cyclical theories of life. In December 1923, Yeats was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature and was determined to make the most of the occasion. He was aware of the symbolic value of an Irish winner so often after Ireland had gained independence and sought to highlight the fact that each available opportunities. His reply to many of the letters of congratulations sent to him contained these words: I consider that this honor has come to me less as an individual than as a representative of the Irish literature. It is a part of Europe's welcome to the Free State. Yeats used the occasion of his acceptance lecture at the Royal Academy of Sweden to present himself as a standard bearer of Irish nationalism and Irish cultural independence. As he remarked, the theatres of Dublin were empty buildings hired by the English travelling companies, and we wanted Irish plays and Irish players. When we thought of these plays, we thought of everything that was romantic and poetical, because the nationalism we had called up, the nationalism every generation had called up in moments of discouragement, was romantic and poetical. The prize led to a significant increase in the sales of his books as his publishers Macmillan sought to capitalize on the publicity. For the first time he had money and he was able to repay not only his own debts but those of his fathers. In the year 1894, Yeats met a friend and a patron lady, Augusta Gregory, in the year 1852 to 1932 of Coley Park, and thus began their involvement with the Irish Literary Theatre, which was found in the year 1899 in Dublin. As its chief playwright, one of the first plays to be performed there was Yeats's Kathleen Ní Howlína, with Goni in the title role. The Abbey Theatre, also known as the National Theatre of Ireland, opened in December of 1904 and became the flagship for the leading Irish playwrights and actors. Yeats on Braille stands was one of its first productions. Of his many dramatic and successful works to follow, The Countess Kathleen, The Land of Heart's Desire, and The King's Threshold are among his best known. When Synge died in the year 1909, Yeats helped to finish his manuscripts for Diary of the Sorrows. In the year 1911, the Abbey Theatre embarked on a tour of the United States. As a successful poet and playwright now, in the year 1903, Yeats went on his first lecture tour to the United States, and again in the year 1914, 1920 and 1932. Yeats and his sister started the Cowler Press in the year 1904, which would print over 70 titles by which authors as Ezra Pound, Rabindranath Tagore, Elizabeth Bowen, Jack and Joan, Yeats and Patrick Kavanagh, before it closed in the year 1946. At the age of 46, in the year 1911, Yeats met Georgia Head Lee, and they married on 20th October 1917. They had two children, Annie, and for whom he wrote the following lines: "A prayer for my daughter, that is, may she be granted beauty and yet not beauty to make a stranger's eye distraught, or hers before a looking glass for such, being made beautiful overmuch. Consider beauty as sufficient end, lose natural kindness, and maybe the heart revealing intimacy that chooses right and never find a friend." Michael was born on 22nd August 1921, for whom Yeats wrote the following lines: "A prayer for my son. Bid a strong ghost stand at the head, that my Michael may sleep sound, nor cry nor turn in the bed, till his morning meal come round, and may departing twilight keep all dread afar till morning's back." Georgie shared Yeats' interest in mystical and esoteric subjects and introduced him to automatic writing. With her assistance, he wrote A Vision in the year 1925. Yeats' attempt at explanation for his elaborate philosophy and use of symbolism in his poetry. At the Hawk's Well is a one-act play by William Butler Yeats, first performed in the year 1916 and published in the year 1917. It was one of the 5 plays by Yeats which are loosely based on the stories of Cuchulainn, the mythological hero of ancient Ulster. It was the first play written in English that utilized many of the features of Japanese O theatre. The form of the play is stylized, abstract, symbolic and ritualistic, unlike the more common realistic and plot-driven theatre of the time. The stage is any bare space before a wall against which stands a patterned screen, and only props are a black cloth with a golden pattern suggesting a hawk, and a blue cloth to represent a well. The actors' costumes are simple, striking and stylized, and the two main protagonists wear masks while the others have their face made up to resemble masks. The puppet-like movement of the actors is accompanied throughout by a drum, a gong and a zither. The play is written in verse and opens and closes with the comments and interpretations of the musicians who speak both individually and together as a chorus. The main body of the play consists of a short drama involving just three protagonists. They are three musicians, the guardian of the well, an old man, a young man. The play is set by a dried up well on a desolated mountainside which is guarded by a hawk-like woman. An old man has kept camp there for 50 years, waiting to drink the miraculous waters from the well which occasionally rise up. Cuchulain arrives at the spot having heard a story that water brings immortality. The old man urges Cuchulain to leave the well, telling of his wasted lifetime there and how. Even the waters did rise up. He was thwarted by a sudden urge to sleep. But Cuchulain is determined to stay and convinced that he shall soon drink the waters. While they speak of the hawk which has attacked Cuchulain earlier in the day and which the old man claims is a supernatural being which carries a curse of discontent and violence. The guardian of the well seems to fall into a trance, arises and begins to dance with hawk-like motions. She then leaves the stage as well water bubbles up. Cuchulain pursues her, but unable to find her, he returns to well to be informed by the old man he has missed the waters. Oblivious, he rushes out again to face the warrior woman, the guardian of the well, has called out to battle, ignoring the old man's plea to stay with him. The different themes that are there in the play are as follows: choice in relation to identity, fate and destiny, age and youth, natural and supernatural, physical and spiritual, mortality and immortality, psychological obstacles, conflict and insight, rationality and impulse, heroic nature, and finally the conflict, the change and transformation that we see in the characters. Yeats' poems play produced during his Senate tenure and beyond are at once local and general, personal and public, Irish and universal. At night, the poet says, could sweat with terror because of the surrounding violence, but he could also generalize those terrifying realities by linking them with events in the rest of the world and with all of history. The energy of the poems written in response to these disturbing times gave astonishing power to his collection that we could read in The Tower, which is often considered his best single book, though The Wild Swans at Cooley, enlarged editions, Michael Roberta's and The Dancer, The Tower, The Winding Stairs, enlarged editions, and Words for Music, perhaps, and other poems, also possess considerable merit. Another important element of the poem in both these collections and other volumes in Yeats' keen awareness of old age. Even his romantic poems from the late 1890s often mention grey hair and weariness, though those poems were written while he was still a young man. But when Yeats was nearly 60, his health began to fail and he was faced with real then imaginary. Nevertheless, despite the author's often keen awareness of his physical decline, the last 15 years of his life were marked by extraordinary vitality and an appetite for life. He continued to write plays which includes Sophocles, King Oedipus, Sophocles and Oedipus at Colonus, and The Words Upon the Window Pane, a full-length work about spiritualism, and in the 18th century Irish writer Jonathan Swift. In the year 1929, as an expression of gaiety, after recovering from a serious illness, he also wrote a series of brash, vigorous poems narrated by a fictitious, old, pleasant woman. That's called Crazy Jane. His pose as the wild old wicked man and his poetical revitalization was reflected in the title of his volume, that is New Poems, in the year 1938. As Yeats aged, he saw Ireland change in ways that angered him. The Anglo-Irish Protestant minority no longer controlled Irish society and culture. And with Lady Gregory's death in the year 1932 and the consequent abandonment of the Coley Park estate, Yeats felt detached from the brilliant achievements of the 18th century Anglo-Irish traditions. According to Yeats's unblushing anti-democratic view, the greatness of Anglo-Irishmen such as Jonathan Swift, philosopher George Beckley, and statesman Edmund Burke contrasted sharply with the undiminishing commonness of contemporary Irish society, which seemed preoccupied with the interest of merchants and peasants. He stated his unpopular opinion in late plays such as Purgatory in the year 1938 and Essays on the Boiler in the year 1939. But Yeats offset his frequently brazen manner with the personal conflicts expressed in his last poems. He faced death with a courage that was founded partly on his vague hope of reincarnation and partly on his admiration for the bold heroism that he perceived in Ireland, in both ancient times and in the 18th century. In proud moods, he could speak in the stern voice of his famous epitaph, written within 6 months of his death, which concludes in his poems, "Under Ben Bulbin, cast a cloud eye on life, on death. Horsemen pass by." By the bold sheerness of those lines is complicated by the error-stricken cry that distracts my thoughts. At the end of another late poem, "The Man and the Echo," and also by the poignantly frivolous lust for the life in the last lines of Politics, the poem that he wanted to close last poems, "But oh that I were young again and held her in my arms." Throughout his last years, Yeats' creative imagination remained very much his own, isolated to a remarkable degree from the successive fashions of modern poetry, despite his extensive contacts with other poets. Literary modernism held no inherent attraction for him except perhaps in his general association with youthful vigor. He admired a wide range of traditional English poetry and drama, and he simply was encountered that during the last 2 decades of his life, his preferences for using rhyme and the strict stanza form would set him apart from the vogue of modern poetry. Yeats's allegiances to poetic tradition did not extend, however, to what he considered an often obscure, overtly learned use of literary and cultural traditions by T.S. Eliot and Pound. Yeats deplored the tremendous enthusiasm among younger poets for Eliot's The Waste Land, published in the year 1922. Disdaining Eliot's flat rhythms and cold, dry mood, Yeats wanted all art to be full of energy. He felt that the literary tradition furnishing Eliot with so many allusions and quotations should only be included in a poem of those traditions had so excited the individual poet's imagination that they could become poetic ingredients of the sort Yeats describes in The Tower. Poets imagining and memories of love, memories of the words of women, all those things whereof man makes a superhuman, mirror resembling dream. Yeats wanted poetry to engage the full complexity of life, but only in so far as the individual poet's imagination had direct access to experience or thought, and only in so far as those materials were transformed by the energy of artistic articulation. He was from first to last a poet who tried to transform the local concerns of his own life by embodying them in the resonantly universal language of his poems. His brilliant rhetorical accomplishments, strengthened by his considerable powers of rhythm and poetic phrase, have earned wide praise from readers and especially from fellow poets, including W.H. Auden. Yeats as a savior of English lyrical poet, Stephen Spender, Theodore Roker, and Philip Larkin, it is not only likely that time will diminish his achievements. Critics who admire his middle work might characterize it as a supple and muscular in its rhythm and sometimes harshly modernist, while others find these poems barren and weak in imaginative power. Yeats's later work found new imaginative inspiration in the mystical system he began to work out for himself under the influence of spiritualism. In many ways, his poetry is a return to the vision of his earlier works. The opposition between the worldly minded man of the sword and the spiritual minded man of God, the theme of the wanderings of Ossian, is reproduced in a dialogue between self and soul. Some critics claim that Yeats spanned the transition from the 19th century into 20th century modernism in poetry, much as Pablo Picasso did in his painting, while others question whether late Yeats has much in common with modernism of Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot's variety. Modernists read the well-known poem The Second Coming as a dirge of the decline of European civilization in the mode of Eliot, but later critics have pointed out that his poem is an expression of Yeats's apocalyptic mystical theories and thus the expression of a mind shaped in the year 1890s. His most important collections of poetry started with The Green Helmet and Responsibilities. In imagery, Yeats's poems become sparer and more powerful as he grew older. In 1920, the poem The Second Coming contains some of literature's most potent images of the 20th century. Turning and turning in the widening grey, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the centre cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-deemed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack of all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Here Yeats incorporates his ideas on the grey, a historical cycle of about 2000 years. He first published this idea in his writing A Vision, which predicted the expected anarchy which would be released around 2000 years after the birth of Christ. The poem also serves as inspiration for the name of the 1958 novel Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. According to some interpretations, the best referred to the traditional ruling classes of Europe who were unable to protect the traditional culture of Europe from the materialistic mass movements. The concluding lines also refer to Yeats's belief that historical and cyclic, that his age represented the end of the cycle that began with the rise of Christianity. And what rough breast, its hour come round at last, Solstice towards Bethlehem to be born. I would like to end with these beautiful words said by Yeats himself. You that would judge me, do not judge alone this book or that. Come to this hallowed place where my friends' portraits hang and look thereon. Ireland's history is in the lineaments trace. Think where man's glory most begins and ends, and say my glory was I had such friends. I hope you have enjoyed this class on William Butler Yeats' one-act play At the Hawk Well. We have seen the poet's techniques, symbolism and images that he has used in his play. Thank you and see you in the next session.